Non-designated heritage assets. Obviously, we're dealing with buildings that are not designated, are not listed. It's a blindingly obvious thing to say. As we all know, the first sort of listing surveys commenced in 1947, and they went through successive sort of resurveys, and often sometimes in the late 1960s with only 2 inspectors working nationally. So really most listed buildings result from the resurveys of rural areas between about 1982 and 1989, and the revisions of some of the urban lists between, well, really over the 1990s and some into the early 2000s. There are still some urban lists, such as in my hometown of Nantwich, which have not been updated since the early 1970s and still have 1 or 2 line descriptions that are often very inaccurate. So that's sort of designation aside, but this map is simply showing the distribution of listed buildings which are dated as being of pre-1550 date. And obviously there are lots and lots of caveats that one should build into such a map. It is, however, if you like, a synoptic map that gives us an idea of where we are likely to find substantially intact, at least evidentially complete pre-1550 fabric in rural areas, that also finds its reflection in how the rebuilding of rural areas relates to the rebuilding sometimes of market towns and even larger urban areas. You'll notice that the weighting of that to the southern part of England, with the exception of some areas further north, such as Calderdale near Halifax, where you've got lots of yeoman clothier houses of the 1550s and earlier, and up into parts of County Durham as well. If we sort of built into that the sort of consideration of pre-1750 buildings, at least those which have been dated through listing surveys as being of that date, or evidentially of that date, should I add, you will see that really that large parts of northern East Anglia and large parts of the east of England are excluded from that, whilst other areas you can see the effects of rebuilding sweeping over Western England, with a considerable weighting, for example, within Cumbria, reflecting the impact of the Galloway cattle trade and all sorts of factors like that from the 1660s. So we are dealing here, I suppose, at a national level. Obviously, we're looking at the potential for whole areas to have a strong characteristic of having non-designated heritage assets. If we go to the next slide. And probably there's another slide, isn't there, beyond that, Cara? Sorry. Yeah, I'll kick off with this one, and then I'll go back one step. So we're looking at here at a distribution of old farmsteads within the West Midlands area. This dates from a survey that was done 10 years ago, and it shows in red and in pink the areas where the survival of traditional farmsteads in the landscape is most marked. And some of those areas, such as in the sort of south, well, sort of the western part and the southwestern part of the West Midlands in Worcestershire along the Welsh borders, are areas with relatively quite high proportion of pre-1550 even, and certainly pre-1750 farmstead buildings, which are listed. But if you go up to the north of that map, to the Oswestry uplands in the northwest and to the Peak District in the northeast of the West Midlands, we're dealing with areas which have a really high survival of traditional farmsteads, but where the numbers, the proportion of farmstead sites that have any listings is the lowest. In parts of the Peak District, we are dealing with fewer than 10% of surviving traditional farmsteads that have any listed buildings, and those are usually farmhouses. If we went to the North Pennines, for example, the figures are even more stark, where often we've got farmhouses attached as part of linear ranges to their working farm buildings of the same date, and sometimes the working farm buildings of the same date are omitted from the list. So we do have quite a considerable issue in rural areas with regard to non-designated heritage assets. And so if we go to the previous slide, Cara, this is just to show how simple assessment using the farmstead assessment framework that was published 10 years ago, how simple it can be. And this is a site in the Hampshire Downs. None of these, this barn was not listed, and it's just outside the village conservation area. It was at that point, this is going back about 12 years now, when we were doing some sort of early work on sort of characterizing farmsteads in this part of England. At this stage, because the building was considered to be without special architectural interest and outside the conservation area, it was initially rejected for, the barn was initially rejected for conversion to domestic use. However, probably the early findings and sort of communicating between ourselves and English Heritage Historic England, the local authorities and the local authority and the owners really showed that this indeed, whilst being not designated, was a highly characteristic, an example highly characteristic of the Hampshire Downs. It's a village edge farmstead. It's very large farms typically develop on the edge of the villages in the Hampshire Downs, and therefore are obviously going to be outside of the conservation area. It's a loose courtyard plan, by which I mean you've got the buildings arranged in a fairly loose form around an open cattle yard. You've got a large aisled threshing barn, aisled barns dating from the 12th, 13th century, being characteristic of this part of England, continuing into the mid-19th century. Weatherboarded timber frame, albeit the timber frame is a mix of Baltic timber, imported Baltic timber, and other sort of waney-edged timber from local standard trees. And thatch. Okay, the significance, it's outside the conservation area, but it's a prominent position. Only the barn remains, but it's a typical example. And one can see by comparing the present situation to the historic maps that the barn related to buildings which are outlined in black to the south of the green line, which is the barn. Buildings which did indeed sort of face into and enclose that loose courtyard. And views of the site are sort of limited as you approach the village because of the modern farm buildings. So it's got good access, and there's real potential for removal of the modern farm buildings and potential for new build that reflects that loose courtyard plan. And that indeed is what happened eventually with this site. And so that touches on really the potential that non-designated heritage assets have, and how important it is to, how in some respects how crazy the situation was I remember when I was going as an historic buildings inspector 25 years ago, 28 years ago, looking at sites where if we designated the building in a rural area, then it would go for conversion. If we didn't designate it, it would go for slow decay demolition within the context of a planning system that was resistant to conversion of these buildings outside of settlement envelopes. So now we're going to go and look at a site that has thrown up some interesting issues. So next slide, Cara. Oh, sorry, the one just before. Sorry, the one just before that. Yeah, so we're back to the West Midlands again, and we're back to the Welsh borders, off to the west of the left, as you're seeing it, of the map. And this is in the Olcan Valley, which is on the sort of the Welsh English border. And the photograph shows a view of this farmstead, which is on the valley side. It's within a pattern of late medieval, early post-medieval enclosure, i.e. enclosure of the pattern of field boundaries firmly established by the 17th century. The whole area is full of farmsteads that some of which are listed as often evidentially from their rubble construction as being sort of mid-late 18th century or early 19th century. In fact, if you often go inside farmhouses and barns and other buildings, you'll find earlier timber frames that have been clad. And indeed, looking at again, using that broader understanding of historic character, which is there in the National Character Areas sort of statement for the farmstead and landscape statement for this area, alerts you to the fact that you are often going to find earlier timber frame survival within stone-clad buildings. This is not one of those. It's an 18th century farmstead rebuilt in part in the early 19th century, but it's set very firmly within this early post-medieval enclosed landscape. And you can see there the hillside grazing what on the other side of the border would be called a frith sort of landscape extending up to the moorland grazing. So next slide. Here we can see the layout of the site. It's a very small sort of little cluster of farm buildings, and these little dispersed clusters or very small courtyards are very characteristic of this part of the Black Mountains area. You will see here immediately the poor condition of many of the buildings, which was the issue when it came to planning, which I'll touch on in a moment. The farmhouse faces south. It has 18th century origin. You can see a slightly asymmetrically placed door reflecting the earlier plan form and the fact that they had to work around an earlier structure, which the walling of which remains. So the farmhouse faces south into its own garden area, and you've got a group of buildings which, despite their very poor condition, are sort of highly, are actually constitute quite a rare survival of a small-scale traditional farmstead characteristic of this area, with a threshing barn, which, if you look at the photograph on the bottom left, the threshing barn is in the foreground of that. A threshing barn with stalls for cattle, again characteristic of the area, and attached to that a cow house and a calves cot, which is in the middle photograph, and then a hay barn which has lost its roof, and you can see the what was an open-fronted hay barn there with a tallet for the hay, which has gone. Sorry, the roof of which has gone. So the buildings are in undoubtedly in a poor condition, but they are highly characteristic of the landscape of this area and firmly merit being considered as non-designated heritage assets. So the buildings were subject to, there was an initial scheme for conversion of the buildings, which was the heritage consultant Sam Hale, who's working on this, did advise the owners that this was probably too large. The buildings were too large in scale, so it was scaled back somewhat. So if you go to the next slide, and sorry, Carl, the next slide beyond that very quickly, and beyond that, sorry, it's the last one. I'm slightly jumping. Yes, you can see there. There is on the left of the slide, you can see there the farmhouse and the proposal to put a roof back on the hay barn in the foreground there, to retain all the retrievable roof timbers, but to integrate those into the conversion of the calves house, the cow house, and the threshing barn, and also retaining you can see there, a proposal for a very small dormer window in the threshing barn, which is actually typical, again, picking up on local characteristics in the area. But you can see there the extension behind the house, and that's been chopped back a little bit now, which extended sort of slightly to the left of the bread oven. And the house is extremely small in scale. But this alteration enables you to be able to still appreciate the building in the landscape, without any intervention in the foreground of the farmstead, which is so important in the views towards it. There was a proposal as well for an additional shed, like an agricultural building, really, just to have agricultural machinery and vehicles for working the moorland grazing, because the new owners are taking over a considerable area of moorland and wanting to sort of restore that as a traditional frith sort of moorland edge landscape. So if we go to the previous, go back to again, sorry, yeah, there we are. So this just sets out in very it summarizes the values. And I know we could be looking at interests, but this is just setting out the evidential and the historic values. So we look in particular at evidential, that you've got the retention of the planned form of a small-scale traditional farmstead, as noted in the local farmstead and landscape statement, with a mix of buildings demonstrating the need to process corn as well as house cattle. There was a lot of debate when this was submitted for planning that surely this is not a barn. Well, it is clearly a barn, and all of these areas did grow corn for feed and domestic consumption, rather than for export. The retention of the plan form, the external walling and the roof materials, and some internal detail. So there's the bread oven, the ladder stair, exposed floor, partial roof structure of the farmhouse, which has retained some fabric remaining of the earlier house, which was aligned down slope. So it's possible that the house was a long house, which is again a characteristic of this area. So you've got the plan form external walling of the threshing barn, the plan form external walling and roofing materials of the cow's cot and calves cot, and some of the internal roofing fabric, the retention of the plan form and lower sections of walling to the hay barn. So we're looking at the whole group. And then when it comes to the historical value, there's the obvious historical value of the group, in reflecting key characteristics of the area in terms of in illustrating through its mix of building types and its small scale, the survival of small scale farms in the Black Mountains into the recent past, which are now rare. And again, we're wanting to really emphasize the importance of the setting, and that was a contentious matter when it came to planning, to demonstrate that the setting's significant, and that was helping to justify the positioning of the extension to the rear of the house, sort of linking the house to the small-scale farm buildings, so that the setting's integral to appreciation of the way that Aubrey's was intended to be used and appreciated in relationship to its surroundings. And there you can see on the slide just an extract from the Farmstead and Landscape Statement for the relevant national character area, which is the Black Mountains, that you're dealing with a farm that's reflecting the predominance of a cattle rearing economy with some growing of corn, that farmsteads are usually only served by only one or two working buildings, were sited within ancient enclosed hillsides, and the generally small-scale irregular pattern of enclosures around farmsteads and hamlets results in woodland clearance in the medieval period, and all of those features are there. So we go to the next slide. We're then considering the impact of the proposal on for conversion on the fabric, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this way of grading impact. But you can see here that probably we've taken a similar approach to assessing this farmstead and assessing the impact of proposals as if it was a listed building. And the difficulty sort of came with this particular site with regard to sort of, I suppose, disagreement about the extent to which the buildings were capable or not of conversion without loss of fabric. Yes, I've seen a query about where the grading matrix is from. It's from different sources. I think I was some of the work with the National Trust. We've developed matrices like this, and I think generally people watching this are free to look at this and adapt it, because it's quite a useful aide-memoire. But this came to be useful when we were considering the impact, and so that we were able to grade, therefore, the impact of restoration of the farmhouse as major beneficial, because it's retaining the historic plan form and features, including the porch, the positioning of the doors, the bread oven, the masonry repair, which is going to be carefully done in lime mortar, retaining historic ironwork, and restoring the local stone tile roof. The construction of the single-story block to the rear is probably the most contentious, but is absolutely key to linking the buildings together and ensuring a new use for the traditional buildings and minimizing the impact of any extensions in the landscape. And so that was assessed as neutral due to its scale, how it's set into the hillside, and the fact that only a small section will be visible in views of the farmstead when you're looking at key views of the farmstead from across the valley. And the use of the glazed link follows well-established precedent, and it makes this clearly legible as a new addition. The conversion of the threshing barn was considered as a moderate beneficial, which, despite the building of an extension, a very small extension to the south, it will conserve the overall form and openings of this small characteristic barn, and there being many local precedents in this area for half lofts, as here. There was again some contention about this, but a half loft doesn't necessarily have to have pockets in the walls to take the cross beams. They can be independently built, and so the proposal for a half loft is very minor impact really on the building, and again is a sort of enabling a use. And conversion of the cow house again graded as being moderate beneficial. For similar reasons. The conversion of the hay barn was more difficult because it would necessitate more substantial reconstruction of its walling. Though the use of the corrugated iron roof reflects results in the eaves and ridge height being probably lower than the original structure. So that was regarded as being sort of minor beneficial as a result of its pleasant condition, that the conversion will involve more substantial reconstruction, but it's still working with what the fabric has to offer. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, that shows the scheme again. So you can see here how we've gone about assessing a non-designated heritage asset, and giving it considerable it has significance as a group that's not far below where I would be grading it, rating it as being a listable group, frankly. But right, over now to for the next case study.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. I think that actually takes me through quite a bit more neatly than I'd thought. I mean, this is just a very quick case study, I think, mainly to try and start off some discussions, some thinking about how we go about putting a lot of what Jeremy's talked about understanding significance and understanding effects into into practice in sort of wider assessments. And this comes from a project I was involved in a few years back when I was still with Wood, and it was a new build and refurbishment of an overhead line through the Vale of York, so running right the way from Shipton in Benningborough, north of York, down to the substation at Monk Fryston, which is next to Ferry Bridge. It runs all the way through that part of the Vale of York, which is a very it's that belt of agricultural land. One of the questions that came up at scoping was how we were going to understand the effect on non-designated heritage assets. And the difficulty here is there were no local lists. The HERs concentrated on archaeological features. They didn't look at historic buildings. So it was how are we going to go about identifying all of these non-designated heritage assets? How are we going to actually understand how valuable they are? How are we going to consider their settings in a way that's proportionate to the effects that are going to arise? And I think that immediately brings up all sorts of issues around methodology, practicability, proportionality in the assessment process. There are other issues in that some of these sites are very, very difficult to access. They're on private land. The nature of that improved agricultural landscape is you have these large farm buildings within wider sort of farmstead complexes that might be half a mile off the road with no public access because they're outside the site boundary. There's no way of confirming access to them, and there's an element of how far do we go in asking for permission from multiple landowners, multiple tenants to go and look. How far can this be done remotely? So really we developed a method based on the historic landscape characterization, using historic map regression, looking at what buildings were built when, trying to ground truth these as far as we could with site visits, try and be able to see what we could. So some of the buildings we just couldn't get at because of what there were. Most we could see, if not from getting quite close to them from the road. Then another issue was around assigning value to buildings you can only see from a distance and understanding their settings. How do we deal with that? Again, things around going back to characterization, taking approaches like that the historic farmsteads approach that Jeremy was talking about, to think about morphology, think about where they fit into that sort of wider context of farmsteads in this landscape. It was a very high level approach because, again, trying to stay proportionate to what were to both to the nature of the effects that we're expecting and to the sheer number of buildings we needed to consider. And I think that was trying to work through that GPA3 methodology to identify what might be affected, and if we could be fairly certain there wouldn't be an effect, moving on quite quickly to things that there might actually be an effect, try and focus on what mattered and what would become material. As I said, mostly what we found were mid-19th century farmhouses. There were clearly going to be other structures, sort of village buildings particularly, but most of those level of effect was pretty limited because of the nature of that setting. So those ones that we moved fairly quickly on from. In terms of the assessment, so if you could just move on one, Cara. I think here is a fairly typical one at a place called Overton, just north of York, or just north and west of York. There's quite a large modern farmstead there. The farmhouse itself is in the middle of that red circle on the map, and you can see it in the photograph from the nearest public access point, which was the access from the road, which is marked by the arrow on the map. It's the red brick farmhouse, about 2/3 sort of in that center left of the image. So 2-story hipped roof, fairly substantial, fairly substantial house. And I think in terms of the assessment, the potential effect was building the overhead line that passes around to the north and west of the house. So you can see actually see the construction areas on Google Earth. It's because the project is currently under construction, and really trying to think about not just in terms of sort of direct visibility, which is quite limited because there's that large modern farmstead in between, but it's looking at trying to understand that relationship of this farmland with that farmstead, trying to think how or whether that visibility of the overhead line affects that relationship or in some way diminishes it, in terms of the historical values, in terms of the architectural values, thinking about architectural composition, the sort of very specific architectural value of what's a very symmetrical kind of classical mid-19th century, late Georgian, really, farmhouse. So I think really it's, in terms of all of those issues, it's trying to think, how do we work out what is a proportionate and appropriate way of dealing with non-designated heritage assets through that wider assessment process. And that is really all I have on that one. So I think, unless